this video I'm going to show you how to make a stitched greeting card with a word on. In this example I'm going to use the word love to stitch my greetings card. And for this you need some card, some thread, offcuts of embroidery floss or yarn or whatever you have to hand, a needle, a pin with some kind of top to help make the holes in, some scissors, and then pencil and ruler to help you mark out your word. Write out the word that you want to stitch on your greetings card. You can just about see here that I've written the word love. If you were doing this this is quite a reflective piece of card, so any pencil mark that I make is going to leave a mark. So I didn't use guidelines, I just kind of judged it by eye. But if you were working on a different type of card, you could draw some guidelines, position it correctly, and you could rub those out afterwards. So the next thing I'm going to do is create the holes for the stitching. And you take your pin and you just work over that pencil line that you've added, putting holes about 5mm apart. And a couple of things to remember about this stage is to firstly open your card out so that you're only working on the front of the card, because you don't want holes to appear on the back. And then as you're creating your holes, you want them about 5mm apart, but for example here where the lines cross over, you just have to think where's best to place your holes. The same here where the line into my O and the line of my O are quite close together. I'm just thinking carefully about where I place my holes. And it's also worth noting that at the bottom of letters where there's a curve, you might want to place the holes slightly closer together just to get a good curve. The other thing to remember is to pop a bit of cardboard or some kind of mat underneath your card when you're making these holes, because you don't want to damage your table. Now if you have written this on a different type of card where you could rub out the pencil line, you don't need to rub it out at this stage. You can leave it there, because especially if you're using quite a thick thread, you're actually going to stitch over it. But you can rub it out if you want, because now you've got your holes there that you're going to use to stitch. Right, I threaded my needle and I'm just going to tie a knot in the end, and the knot needs to be bigger than the hole. I'm making mine nice and big, and I'm just going to trim those loose bits off of it just so it's a bit of a neater knot. So I'm going to start at the bottom of the L, and you'll find that you need to keep on flipping your card over when you're stitching on card. If you're used to embroidering on fabric, you'll know that most of the time you can just feel from the back where the needle's coming up. You can't really do that with card, because you'll just create more holes that you don't want. So I'm just going to do a simple back stitch for this. So for back stitch, you bring the needle up through the card and then down in the next hole, and then you bring it up through the third hole and down through the second hole, and then you just keep on bringing it up and down. You're basically creating a continuous line of stitching. I'm using quite a long bit of thread, which is bad because if you use long bits of thread you get into tangles like you've just seen. Oh, I came up the same hole I went down in, which is why that stitch just unravelled. You could do this in running stitch if you wanted as well, which is basically just backstitch, but instead of filling in the gap here, you'd leave that blank, so you'd have a stitch, no stitch, stitch, no stitch. The other stitch that I've used for this design that I really like to work with is called whipped running stitch and whipped backstitch. So you lay down your layer of running stitch or backstitch first, and then you go over it, kind of weaving your needle around the stitches that you've already got. So keep an eye on the back of the card as you're stitching. If you want to make sure that you don't get any knots or loose stitches there. And it's sometimes useful just to put your finger over the hole where you're stitching. It just helps kind of feel for any knots or lumps that are coming through. And also just to be careful, I keep on getting the thread caught on the corner of the card, just watch out for that as well. If you're using a shorter length of thread, about 50 centimetres, you won't have that problem quite so much. So this design's really good for personalising your handwriting, or perhaps the handwriting of your kids, or you could write out a favourite quote. It doesn't have to be one short 4-letter word. I just chose this because it's a nice and easy one to demonstrate. You could add other elements, like with this you could perhaps put little love hearts around other parts of the card. You can really be creative with how you finish off the card. So at this crossover point here, rather than going through the thread that was already stitched down, I've just gone slightly to one side. This does have quite a lot of stitching to it, so bear that in mind when you do decide what phrase you want to put on your card. Now down the bottom here, the holes are a little bit close together just to get the curve on this part, whereas compared to the L at the top here, it's a bit pointy. So for the O, what I'm going to do is stitch to the top, and then I'm going to come back and do the bottom of the O before going back to the top, and I'll just show you how I find it easiest to do that, so you don't have to like start another thread. You should be able to do it in one bit of thread. Obviously if you're using shorter bits of thread you may need to tie things off and start another thread, but that's fine. I'm just going to make an extra hole there just to get around this curve a bit better. They are a little bit close together, so I'm just going to be careful when I pull this through not to rip. Right, so I'm at the top of the O now, and I can either go around here or I can carry on and do the rest. I'm going to fill in this round bit of the O and then come back and do the rest. So what I'm going to do is stitch this in running stitch so that when I come back I can fill in the gaps in between. And this is actually a stitch called Holbein stitch. And it may be how you do your back stitch. I find it useful for things like this where you need to come back to a starting point, but you don't want to tie the thread off. Now I'm going to start working my way back round. So yeah, as I said before, you could stitch it all in running stitch if you wanted to. You still get the same kind of idea. And you can do this with kids if you wanted to. You could get them to write something that they then stitch over, or maybe they write something that you stitch over. If you are going to do this with kids, then I recommend you poking the holes. Both for safety reasons, you don't want them kind of sticking holes in their fingers or in your table, but also you do need to be quite accurate when you're poking the holes. You don't want to have extra holes that you're not going to stitch through, because they just will look a bit odd. And you can also give them a needle with less of a point on, a round tip needle, like a cross stitch needle. Now, when I've made this before, the way I write my E's, I've discovered the loop on the E is quite close to the top of the E. So when I wrote the template out for this, I made sure that my loop that forms my E was a bit bigger than normal, so that the lines weren't too close together, because the previous time I did it, the lines were too close together and the card ripped when I was stitching it, which, especially as it's the last letter I was stitching, was very frustrating. If that happens to you, what you can do is just undo the stitch, pop a bit of tape on the back, kind of seal the rip as best you can, and then re-stitch it through the tape. And the tape should provide enough stability and support to hold the stitches. A couple of layers of tape might be needed if it's a really bad rip. Right, just a few more stitches to go, and then I'll show you just how to finish off. And you don't have to worry about what the back side of the card looks like. I'll show you what the back side looks like. I think it's nice not to hide the stitches. You could put glue a bit of paper over or something to hide the stitches, but I think for something like this, which is obviously handmade, showing off the stitching and the back of the stitching is part of the charm. You could put sticky tape over to hold the stitches in place, or at least at the end and the beginning where the knots are if you wanted. But I find mostly that knots hold. One more stitch. So there's my word love. There's a few bits of dust from the holes of when you're bringing the needle through that you can just wipe off. And then to tie off your thread, just loop it through one of the previous stitches. I normally loop it through once first and then loop it through again, and then this second time just pass your needle through the thread loop. And if you want it extra secure, just repeat that again. So through that, and you create a little knot and pull it tight, and then zip. So that's what the inside of the card looks like, and that's what the front of the card looks like.